From 1961 to 1989, the Berlin Wall marked the front line of the Cold War. It separated global superpowers and divided Eastern communism from Western capitalist democracy. This split and the tensions it caused defined the second half of the 20th century. During this time, significant changes were occurring all over the world. Each decade was driven by major social movements and massive advancements in technology, all connected to the ongoing struggle between East and West. Here's a look into some of the major events that happened around the globe while the Berlin Wall stood.
A few years before the wall was built, a new form of Cold War competition took the world stage. In 1957, the Soviets surprised the Americans when they launched a satellite called Sputnik. It was the world's first man-made object to be placed in Earth's orbit, and the success was seen as a shift in power toward the communists. A few weeks later, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 with a live dog on board, and the public perception turned against them. The US soon sent their own satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit, and with that, the race was truly on. The Soviets put the first man in space. In less than a month, the US followed suit. In 1965, both countries achieved spacewalks, with astronauts spending several minutes outside of their ships. The Soviets made it there before the US, but the Americans nearly doubled their time. By 1968, the US had pulled ahead in the race, and with the help of a higher budget, NASA sent the first humans to orbit the moon. About 6 months later, on July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 space mission set off. When they landed after 4 days, Neil Armstrong took the first steps on the moon's surface.
During the years that the Berlin Wall divided Europe, communist and capitalist nations also clashed much more directly. For years, the US had dominated the nuclear arms race, but the Soviets were working fast to catch up. In 1962, an American spy plane photographed Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba, less than 150 kilometers off the coast of mainland United States. The placement of these weapons changed the balance of power dramatically. Only after an intense 13-day standoff and careful negotiation was all-out nuclear war avoided. 3 years later, the US dramatically increased their involvement in the Vietnam War. They had already been supporting South Vietnam's fight against the Northern Communist regime for nearly a decade. And when 2 US destroyers were attacked off the coast of northern Vietnam, America scaled up their presence to a full-fledged military intervention.
Throughout the 1960s and 70s, a shockwave spread across Western cultures starting from the United States and United Kingdom. A variety of social issues fueled this countercultural movement, but it was generally characterized by a lack of trust in established systems and a strong belief in freedom of every kind. In 1962, the Beatles released their first single in the UK. Their music quickly spread across the Atlantic and became a hallmark of counterculture on both sides of the ocean. Their song's frequent messages about the power of love appealed to the many young hippies in the US who were protesting against the country's increased involvement in the Vietnam War. Other major causes central to counterculture were ongoing civil rights movements, the fight for women's rights, the beginning of gay liberation, and the emphasis on environmentalism. Within less than 10 years, Martin Luther King Jr. had given his defining "I Have a Dream" speech. The Stonewall riots had kick-started the gay rights movement, and the first Earth Day had been celebrated.
As the main events of the space race came to a close, another age of advancement began to pick up speed. The same year that the United States put a man on the moon, the earliest version of the internet was created back on Earth. and by 1977, companies were mass-producing personal computers. These developments fundamentally remodeled the way the world worked. To make the most of new technologies, traditional industries rapidly shifted the way they did business, and the sweeping changes triggered by the digital revolution weren't limited to economic structures. Governments, cultures, and individuals all had to adjust to the new systems. This era was also marked by major breakthroughs in the life sciences. In 1978, Louise Brown became a medical marvel in the UK. She was the first human born after conception by in vitro fertilization. And within the first half of the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic went from unrecognized to beginning treatment research. By the time the World Wide Web launched, societies around the world were already moving closer together. Driven by emerging transportation and communications technology, many ideological and other lines of difference were blurring as cultures became more integrated.
While nations such as China stood firm in their communist policies despite the increasingly interconnected world, the Soviets began to make changes. Over the course of several years, Soviet leader Gorbachev focused on restructuring the Soviet Union for more transparency and openness. Ultimately, these changes would contribute to the fall of his regime. The reforms Gorbachev introduced ranged across all aspects of politics and the economy, as he tried to improve the Soviet Union's struggling financial system. He loosened tight, centralized control over business, making the economy more like a free market. Although many members of his government pushed back against the changes, Gorbachev continued. He reduced restrictions on foreign trade and even encouraged Western investment for a brief time before reversing to his original policy. And in 1988, Gorbachev lowered the numbers of troops present in satellite nations, announcing that the Soviet Union would no longer interfere in their domestic affairs. He even held and won the first truly democratic elections since 1917. But Gorbachev's strongly opposed efforts failed to improve the economy, and the Soviet bloc was left critically weakened. It was the beginning of the end of the Cold War.
While the Berlin Wall stood, the world underwent more change than it has in almost any other era. Humans walked on the moon, mobile phones were introduced, and the Boeing 747 flew for the first time. The world became more connected, but divisions remained. Decolonization saw the birth of new nations, while wars broke out in other regions. Cultures responded to these challenges, sparking major social movements. The Berlin Wall remained through the decades, but increasing tensions began creating cracks in the divide. Stay tuned for our next video to see the story of how the Berlin Wall ultimately fell.